The village of Ashenmere had no walls. This was not an oversight. It was a philosophy. Sable's mother had explained it to her when she was small enough to sit in her mother's lap and watch the sun go down over the marshes that gave the village its name, ashen reeds and dark water stretching to the tree line, the air heavy with peat and wild mint. "Walls tell people what you're afraid of," her mother said. "We have nothing to hide and nothing worth stealing, and anyone who needs shelter can see from a distance that they're welcome here." It was a kind way to think about the world. It was also, as it turned out, a fatal one. But that came later. For 24 years, Ashenmere existed at the edge of Blackmoor territory, the way a bird exists at the edge of a field. Small, quiet, unremarkable, and entirely dependent on the larger thing not noticing it. 63 people lived there. Sable knew every one of their names because knowing names was the first thing her mother had taught her and the thing her blood made impossible to forget. Sable's gift had come from her mother's line, eidetic memory, though the village did not use that word. They called it the keeping. Every generation, one daughter in the bloodline was born with the ability to hear something once and hold it forever, perfectly, without erosion or distortion. Sable's grandmother had been a keeper. Her mother, Elowyn, was a keeper, and Sable, from the age of 3, when she had recited back a trader's full inventory list after hearing it read once, was unmistakably the next. In a village without walls, the keeper was the wall, not a physical defense, but a living archive, a woman who held the names of every person who had been born, lived, married, or died in Ashenmere and in the surrounding border villages that were too small to keep written records. When a child was born, the parents brought the baby to the keeper and spoke the name, and the keeper held it. When someone died, their name was spoken to the keeper a final time, and she held that too. Birth and death and everything between, carried in a single mind, protected by memory that did not fade. Sable had been her mother's apprentice since she was old enough to grind herbs. Elowyn was the village healer. The keeping and the healing had always gone together in their family because knowing a person's name was the first step in knowing how to help them. Sable had learned to set bones and mix poultices and identify fever by the smell of a person's sweat before she was 12. By 20, she could deliver a baby in the dark by touch alone. By 24, she was doing most of the healing work herself, while Elowyn's joints stiffened and her eyes dimmed, though her mother's memory remained perfect, crystalline, vast, holding the names of 4 generations. Sable was 25 when the fire came. She would later calculate that it must have been past midnight when Theron Blackmoor's soldiers arrived, because she had been deep in the kind of sleep that only comes in the small hours, thick and dreamless, the sleep of a body that had spent the day walking the marsh paths to gather watermint and bone set. Her wolf woke first, not a shift, just the animal part of her consciousness, lifting its head inside her chest, ears pricked, a low vibration of warning that translated into Sable's sleeping brain as wrongness before her human mind could name what kind. She opened her eyes. The ceiling of her mother's cottage was orange, not candlelight, not dawn, the orange of something large burning very close. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, pulling on her boots, crossing the room to where her mother slept. "Mama, Mama, wake up." Her voice was steady. She had trained herself to keep her voice steady in emergencies because patients needed calm, and calm started with the healer. Elowyn was already sitting up. Her eyes, dimmed by age but sharpened by decades of surviving on a contested border, found the orange light on the ceiling and understood it before Sable did. "They're burning the village." "Who?" "It doesn't matter who. Get the satchel." The brown one with the dried yarrow and the binding cloth. Get it now!" Sable grabbed the satchel from its hook by the door. When she turned back, her mother was standing by the hearth, pulling a loose stone from the wall. Behind it was a leather pouch that Sable had never seen. "What is that?" "Names," Elwyn said. She pressed the pouch into Sable's hands. It was heavier than it looked. "Every village between here and the Greymoor border, every name I've kept in 50 years, written down just in case." She held Sable's face in both hands. "You already have them in your head, everyone. But the paper is for the people who need to see proof with their eyes because they can't hear truth with their ears. Mama, come with me. I'm slow, love. My hip won't make the marsh path in the dark. I'll carry you. You will not. You'll run. You'll take the names and you'll run south toward the marsh and you will not stop and you will not come back. Do you hear me?" The door burst inward, not knocked, kicked, the wood splintering along the iron hinges. A soldier in a dark leather armor stood in the frame, torch in one hand, sword in the other. Behind him, the village was a wall of fire, cottages burning, the granary burning, the healing shed where Sable had spent 10,000 hours learning to mend what was broken, burning. Elwyn stepped between the soldier and her daughter. She was 58 years old and 5 feet tall, and her hip ached in the cold, and she had not lifted anything heavier than a mortar in years. She stepped between them anyway. "Run, Sable!" The soldier moved. Elwyn did not move out of the way. Sable ran. She ran through the back wall of the cottage where the daub was thin, and her shoulder went through it like paper. She ran into the dark of the marsh with the satchel on her back and the leather pouch clutched against her chest and the sound of her mother's village dying behind her. She ran through the reeds and the black water and the peat that sucked at her boots. She ran until the orange light behind her was just a glow on the low clouds and the screaming had faded to silence and her lungs burned and her legs shook and her wolf howled inside her chest with a grief so vast it had no sound. She collapsed at the edge of a pond she had gathered mint from 100 times. The water was still. The sky was full of stars. Behind her, Ashenmere burned. She lay in the mud and pressed the leather pouch against her heart and whispered names. Her mother's name, her mother's mother's name, the names of every person in the village. Hale the carpenter, Mare and his wife, their twin boys, Fen and Rowan. Old Dotty who kept bees, Cade the blacksmith, Lissa who wove baskets. Pim who was 7 and missing his front teeth and always asked Sable to look at his tongue when she made rounds because he thought the healer checking his tongue was the funniest thing in the world. 63 names, she whispered every one. Not because she was afraid of forgetting. She could not forget, it was physically impossible for her to forget. But because speaking their names into the dark was all she could do for them now, and she would not let the night pass without someone saying who they were. In the morning she went back. She knew she would. Her mother had told her not to, but her mother had also taught her that a healer's first duty was to the living, and if anyone had survived, they would need her. No one had survived. The village was ash and charcoal and heat. Some structures still smoldered. The granary was a skeleton of blackened beams. The healing shed was gone entirely, reduced to a flat black scar on the ground, where every herb she had dried, and every poultice she had mixed, and every bandage she had rolled had become nothing. She found her mother in the doorway of their cottage. Elwyn had not moved from where she had stood between the soldier and her daughter. She had died exactly where she chose to die, and the expression on her face, beneath the soot and the stillness, was not fear. It was the particular calm of a woman who had spent her entire life knowing exactly what mattered, and who had, in the final moment, acted accordingly. Sable knelt beside her. She did not cry. The grief was too large for tears. It filled her body like floodwater, pressing against the inside of her ribs, and there was no room for anything else, not tears, not sound, not thought, just the vast hydraulic pressure of a loss that had not yet found its shape. She closed her mother's eyes. She sat with her for a long time. The morning light came gray and flat through the smoke that still hung over the ruins. Then she opened the leather pouch. Inside were pages, dozens of them, thin and tightly written in her mother's precise hand. Names, hundreds of names organized by village. Ashenmere, 63 names. Thornwick, 41. Brackenmoor, 28. Fiddler's Crossing, 35. Mill Hollow, 52. Each village listed with names, birth years, family connections, a written archive of every border settlement between Blackmoor and Greymoor territory. And at the bottom, folded separately, a different document. Not names, numbers, dates, coordinates. A careful record kept in her mother's handwriting of every village that had been burned in the past decade. 14 villages, 14 dates, 14 locations, all within Blackmoor territory, all along the same expanding border, all burned in the same pattern. Midnight raids, total destruction, no survivors left to report. Her mother had been tracking it. For years, Elowyn had been quietly collecting information from traders and travelers and the few refugees who had passed through Ashenmere, piecing together the pattern of destruction that was moving slowly, methodically toward their village. She had written it all down. She had prepared the pouch. She had kept it behind a stone in the wall and waited, and when the fire came, she had handed her daughter both the proof and the names and told her to run. Sable stared at the pages. 14 villages, 14 dates. A map of erasure drawn by a man who thought no one was watching. Someone had been watching. Her mother had been watching. Sable stood. She looked south toward the Blackmoor interior, where Theron's hold sat in its ring of conquered territory. She looked north toward the mountains that marked the Greymoor border. Between here and there lay Blackmoor's domain. 40 days of walking through the territory of the man who had burned her village and killed her mother. 40 days through patrols and checkpoints and open ground with no cover. 40 days carrying pages that would end Lord Theron Blackmoor's reign and possibly his life. She had no horse. The horses were dead. She had no money. The coin box had melted. She had no food except what she could find on the road. She had the satchel of healing supplies, the leather pouch of names and evidence, the clothes on her back and her boots. She looked at her boots. Good leather made by Hale the carpenter's brother in Thornwick. Sturdy, well-fitted, the kind of boots that could carry you a long way. She looked north again. 40 days. She started walking. On the 3rd day, she lost the boots. She was crossing a stretch of lowland bog when the mud took the left one. It happened the way these things happen. One step, solid ground. The next step, nothing beneath her foot but cold black muck that gripped the boot and held it while her momentum carried her forward. She went down on her hands and knees, pulled herself free, reached back for the boot. Gone, swallowed. She could see the hole where the mud had taken it, already filling with dark water, and she dug with her hands for 10 minutes before she accepted that the bog had claimed it. She walked the rest of the day with one boot. By evening, the imbalance had wrenched her ankle, and the barefoot was cut in 4 places from the rocky ground at the bog's edge. She sat on a stone and looked at her feet, one booted, one bare and bleeding, and made a decision that felt in the moment like giving up, but was actually the opposite. She took off the other boot. If she was going to walk 40 days on broken ground, she would walk them evenly. Both feet bare, both feet learning the ground at the same time, building the same calluses, sharing the same pain. She would not limp into Greymoor lopsided. She would arrive on 2 feet that had earned every step equally. She left the remaining boot on the stone, a marker, the last piece of the life she was walking away from. The first 10 days were Blackmoor territory, and they were the most dangerous. Theron's patrols moved in predictable patterns. Sable had learned this from traders who visited Ashenmere, men who knew which roads were watched and at what hours. She walked at night when she could, sleeping in ditches and hollow trees during the day, her small dark wolf pressed close against her human skin, keeping her warm in the cold October dark. She ate what she found, late blackberries, crab apples, sour enough to make her jaw ache, watercress from stream banks, the inner bark of birch trees stripped and chewed until the nutrients released. Her mother had taught her which plants were safe. Her mother had taught her everything. On the 5th night, she nearly walked into a patrol camp. She smelled the smoke before she saw the fire. Wood smoke and roasting meat and the particular oily stink of treated leather armor. She dropped flat in the grass and lay still while her heart hammered. The soldiers were 30 paces away, 4 of them around a low fire, talking in the bored, lazy way of men who did not expect trouble and would not know what to do with it if it came. She heard them talking about Ashenmere. One of them mentioned it by name, and her wolf snarled inside her chest so hard she tasted copper. "Cleaned out easy," one soldier said. "Old healer woman tried to block a doorway. Can you imagine? 60 years old, and she plants herself in front of Garrett like she's going to stop him with her bare hands." Laughter. Low, careless, the laughter of men who did not think of what they had done as something that required gravity. "Lord Theron'll be pleased. That's the whole eastern marsh cleared now. Nothing between here and the border but empty ground." Sable lay in the grass with her cheek pressed against the cold earth and her hands gripping the leather pouch against her stomach, and she breathed. In, out, in, out. She did not cry. She did not make a sound. Not. She waited until the soldiers banked their fire and rolled into their bedrolls, and she waited another hour after that, listening to their breathing deepen into sleep. And then she crawled on her belly through the grass like a snake until she was 200 paces away, and then she stood, and then she walked. Her feet bled every day for the first 10 days. The ground in Blackmoor territory was hard-packed clay and loose shale, and every step was a negotiation between her skin and the earth. By the 3rd day, the soles of her feet were raw. By the 5th, they were bleeding through the strips of cloth she had torn from her undershirt to wrap them. By the 8th, the blood had dried into a crust that cracked and bled again with each step, and the pain had become a constant, not sharp anymore, but deep, a bone-level ache that lived in her feet and radiated up through her ankles and knees and into her hips. She walked through it, not because she was brave, though she was, not because she was strong, though she was that too. She walked because the names were in her head and the proof was in her pouch, and every step north was a step closer to someone who might listen. And stopping meant the names would stop with her, and Theron would keep burning, and the dead would stay uncounted. She could not let the dead stay uncounted. That was the keeper in her, the inherited, bone-deep, unshakable conviction that names mattered, that every person who had lived deserved to be remembered, that the act of carrying a name forward through time was not a burden, but a sacred duty. Her mother had died to give her the chance to carry these names to safety. She would not waste that death by sitting down. On the 11th day, she crossed the river that marked the edge of Blackmoor's actively patrolled territory and entered the wasteland between the 2 domains, 50 miles of unclaimed ground that neither lord had bothered to govern. Rocky moorland, windswept and treeless, cut through with streams running cold from the northern mountains. No roads, no settlements, no shelter except the occasional shepherd's bothy, stone huts built into hillsides with turf roofs and dirt floors, used during summer grazing and abandoned the rest of the year. She found one on the 12th day and slept in it for 14 hours. Her body had reached the point where sleep was not a choice but a collapse. She lay down on the dirt floor and her consciousness switched off like a candle being pinched. When she woke, her feet had swollen to twice their normal size, and she could not stand for 20 minutes. She sat in the bothy's doorway and looked at her feet and assessed them with the clinical eye her mother had trained into her. Multiple lacerations, some infected. 2 toes on the right foot were broken, the small toe and the one beside it, probably from a rock she had stepped on in the dark 3 days ago. The left heel was deeply cracked, the kind of crack that would scar. Both soles were developing calluses, thick, yellowish pads of new skin growing over the wounds like armor being forged in real time by a body that had decided, at some cellular level, to adapt rather than fail. She treated what she could with the supplies in her satchel, yarrow paste on the infected cuts, binding cloth wrapped tight around the broken toes, a poultice of chewed plantain leaves pressed against the cracked heel. She ate watercress and a handful of dried bilberries she had found in the bothy's rafters, left by some shepherd months ago. She drank from the stream that ran past the door. She stood up. She walked. The wasteland days blurred into each other. Walk, rest, eat what she could find, walk again. The landscape was beautiful in a way that hurt, vast and open and wild, the kind of beauty that existed because no one had tried to own it. The wind came down from the mountains and smelled like snow and stone and distance. Hawks circled overhead. Once a red deer watched her from a ridge for 10 minutes before vanishing, and the silence after it left was so complete she could hear her own blood moving through her veins. She talked to herself. Not out of madness, out of necessity. She recited the names, all of them, every village, every person. She walked through the moorland, whispering Ashenmere's 63 names, and Thornwick's 41, and Brackenmoor's 28, and all the rest, over and over, a rolling litany that matched the rhythm of her walking, so that each step became a syllable, and each mile became a verse, and the walk itself became a kind of prayer spoken by her feet and her mouth simultaneously. It kept her sane. It kept her moving. When the pain in her feet became unbearable, she would start the list again from the beginning, and the names would fill her mind so completely that there was no room left for the pain, and she would walk another mile before she noticed it again. On the 17th day, she met the woodcutter's wife. The woman appeared at the door of a bothy that Sable had assumed was abandoned. She was weathered and gray-haired and wide as a wagon, with the kind of face that had seen everything and decided to be kind about most of it. She looked at Sable, thin, filthy, barefoot, swaying on her feet, and said, "Oh, for the love of every god there is, sit down before you fall down." Her name was Dagny. Her husband cut timber in the mountain forests, and she lived in the bothy during the cutting season, smoking fish and mending clothes and waiting for him to come down. She fed Sable real food, hot food, smoked trout and barley bread, and a stew of root vegetables that tasted like the best thing Sable had ever eaten, because it was the first hot meal she had had in 17 days. Dagny looked at Sable's feet while she ate. She looked for a long time. Her expression went through several stages: surprise, then disgust, then something harder and colder that was not directed at Sable, but at whatever had put a young woman on a road with no shoes. "Where are you going, girl?" "Greymoor." "That's 23 days' walk from here, more for someone in your state." "I know." "Why?" Sable looked at her. The fire was warm and the food was solid in her stomach, and the temptation to stay here, in this safe, dry place with this kind woman, was so strong it made her teeth ache. She could stay. She could rest for a week, heal her feet, eat real food, sleep on something that was not cold ground. She could stop. But the names were in her head, and the dead were waiting, and every day she rested was a day Theron Blackmoor's borders expanded, and another village disappeared. "I'm carrying names," she said. "People who were killed. I have to get them to someone who will do something about it." Dagny studied her for a long moment. Then she stood and went to a chest in the corner and came back with a pair of thick wool socks and a pouch of dried venison and a small clay pot sealed with wax. "Honey and pine resin," she said, pressing the pot into Sable's hands. "For your feet. Put it on every night. It won't stop the bleeding, but it'll keep the infection out. I can't take your—" "You can and you will. And you'll wear the socks until they fall apart, and then you'll keep walking without them because that's what you were going to do anyway." Dagny's voice was gruff, but her eyes were wet. "I can see it in you, girl. You're not going to stop, so at least let me make the not stopping a little less terrible." Sable slept in the bothy that night, warm and fed and wearing thick socks for the first time in 17 days. She left at dawn. Dagny stood in the doorway and watched her go, a wide gray-haired woman silhouetted against the morning light, and she called out after her, "What's your name?" Sable turned. "Sable. I'll remember it." The socks lasted 4 days. By the 21st day, they were more whole than wool, and on the 22nd, Sable pulled the last shredded remnants from her feet and kept walking on bare soles that had begun, at last, to toughen into something that could endure. The calluses were real now, thick and hard in her own, armor her body had built for itself. The cuts still opened and bled in new places, but the older wounds were scarring over, and the broken toes had settled into their new crooked shapes, and her feet were becoming something different from what they had been. Not the soft feet of a village healer, not wounded feet anymore either. Walking feet, endurance feet. Feet that had learned what the ground was made of and had decided to match it. On the 23rd night, she dreamed of her mother. Not the last image, not the doorway, not the soldier, but an older memory, deep and warm, from a time when Sable was 8 years old and had cut her hand on a broken pot in the healing shed. She had come running to her mother with blood streaming between her fingers and tears on her face, and Elowyn had knelt down and taken her small hand in both of hers, and looked at the cut with the calm, appraising gaze of a healer who had seen 1,000 worse wounds, but who treated this one as if it were the most important injury in the world. "Tell me the names of the herbs I'll use," Elowyn had said, not to quiz her, to distract her from the pain. "Yarrow for the bleeding, calendula for the healing, honey to keep it clean." "Good girl. Now tell me them again while I work." And Sable had recited the herbs while her mother cleaned and dressed the wound. And by the time the bandage was tied, the tears had stopped and the pain had become something manageable, something named, something she understood. She woke from the dream on cold moorland ground with the names of herbs on her lips and the memory of her mother's hands so vivid she could feel them, and she understood then what her mother had been teaching her all those years. Not just healing, not just the keeping. She had been teaching her daughter that naming a thing, a wound, a herb, a person, was the first act of power over it. That what you could name you could survive, that what you could remember you could carry. She stood up. She started walking. She named the herbs as she went: yarrow, calendula, comfrey, plantain, boneset, elder, willow, and they joined the village names in the rhythm of her steps, and the rhythm became a kind of music, and the music carried her through the 24th day, and into the 25th. On the 25th day, she found a stream that was clean enough to bathe in. She had not been fully clean since Dagny's bothy. She stripped off her clothes and waded in, and the cold water hit her skin like a slap, and she gasped, and her wolf surged inside her chest, and for a moment she was both human and animal, woman and wolf, standing in a mountain stream with her arms wrapped around herself, and the cold water running over her scarred feet, and the sky above her vast and gray and open and entirely impossibly hers. She scrubbed the dirt from her skin and the tangles from her hair, and she washed her clothes on the rocks and spread them on a sunny boulder to dry, and she sat in the stream's shallows and let the cold water numb her feet, and for 20 minutes she did not walk and she did not recite names, and she simply existed, a body in a stream, alive. Then she dressed, and she walked. The mountains grew closer every day. The Greymoor range, dark granite peaks streaked with snow, cutting the northern sky like teeth. She could see the pass she was aiming for, a notch in the ridgeline that traders used during the summer months. It would be cold. It might already be snowed in. She did not let herself think about that. On the 26th day, she shifted. She had not shifted since Ashenmere. Her wolf had been present, awake, alert, a constant low hum of animal awareness beneath her human thoughts. But she had not let it out. Shifting required energy, and she had none to spare. But on the 26th day, crossing a high ridge in a bitter wind that cut through her clothes like they were made of nothing, her human body reached a limit. Her legs stopped working. Not gradually. They simply stopped, the muscles seizing, the joints locking, and she fell on the ridge with the wind tearing at her and the granite beneath her, and no shelter in any direction. Her wolf came out because it had to. The shift was not graceful. It was a spasm, a last resort reorganization of failing flesh, and when it was done, she lay on the ridge in wolf form, small and dark brown and panting, and the wind slid over her fur instead of through it. 4 legs instead of 2, lower to the ground. Warmer, harder to kill. She walked the ridge on 4 paws and descended the far side into a valley where the wind could not reach. And there she shifted back and lay in the grass and shivered until her human body remembered how to regulate its own temperature. From then on, she shifted when she had to. Wolf at night for warmth, human during the day for the hands she needed to climb and forage and dress her wounds. The 2 forms traded off like workers on a shift, one resting while the other carried the load. Her wolf was small, but it was built for this, built for distance and endurance, built to cover ground in a steady, tireless lope that 8 miles the way water eats stone, slowly and without stopping. On the 30th day, she reached the pass. It was not snowed in. It was close. The trail was icy and the wind at the top was strong enough to push her sideways. But the snow had not yet fallen in earnest, and she crossed in 5 hours of careful climbing, her bare feet on frozen rock, her hands gripping stone, the leather pouch strapped inside her clothes against her skin where her body heat kept it dry. When she reached the other side and looked down into Greymoor territory for the first time, she stopped. Below her, the land spread out in a vast sweep of gray-green moorland, cut through with silver streams, dotted with dark stands of pine. In the far distance, barely visible against the mountain's flank, a fortress of dark granite. Greymoor Hold, the seat of the Alpha King. She was 10 days away. She had made it over the mountains. She was in Greymoor territory, and the names were still in her head, and the proof was still in her pouch, and she was alive. She sat on a rock on the Greymoor side of the pass, and she cried. She had not cried since Ashenmere. The tears came now the way her wolf had come on the ridge, not chosen but necessary, a biological event that her body executed without her permission because it had been deferred too long. She cried for her mother and for Ashenmere and for her feet and for the 30 days of walking and for the fact that she was still alive when 63 people were not, and the tears ran down her face and fell onto the frozen rock, and she let them come. Because there was no one to see and no one to judge, and the mountains did not care. When she was done, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood and started walking down into Greymoor. The last 10 days were the hardest because hope was harder than despair. Despair had a certain efficiency to it. When she had been walking through Blackmoor territory with no guarantee of survival, the math was simple. Walk or die. There was a clarity in that, a stripped-down purity of purpose that made each step self-evident. But now she was in Greymoor territory, close enough to see the hold, close enough to taste the end, and hope made everything harder because hope meant she had something to lose again. Her body knew it was close. Her body started failing. The adrenaline and the survival chemicals that had kept her upright for a month began to recede like a tide going out, and what they left behind was a woman who had not eaten properly in 30 days, whose feet were a map of damage, whose muscles had consumed themselves for fuel, whose bones ached with a fatigue so deep it felt geological. She fell on the 34th day, tripped on a root, went down hard, lay in the heather for an hour before she could convince her legs to stand. She fell again on the 36th, and the 37th. Each time it took longer to get up. Each time the ground felt more comfortable, and the prospect of standing felt more impossible. And each time she pressed the leather pouch against her chest and whispered a different name each time, cycling through the villages, and the name gave her enough to stand. She tried to count the steps, gave up at 10,000. The number didn't matter, only the next one. On the 39th day, walking across open moorland in a thin, cold rain, she saw riders, 2 of them on the ridge above her, silhouetted against the gray sky. They wore dark cloaks and carried weapons, and they were watching her. She stopped. Her wolf went rigid inside her chest. Her hands found the leather pouch and held it. One of the riders called down, "Who are you? State your business on Greymoor land." Sable opened her mouth. Her voice came out cracked and thin, a sound that barely qualified as speech. She had not spoken to another person since Donnie, 22 days ago. "My name is Sable. I've walked from Ashenmere in Blackmoor territory. I need to see the Alpha King." The riders looked at each other. The one who had spoken nudged his horse down the slope toward her. As he got closer, she watched his eyes travel from her face to her body to her feet. The feet stopped him. She saw it. The small, involuntary flinch, the tightening of his jaw. Her feet were not a thing you looked at casually. They were evidence. "How long have you been walking?" 39 days. A silence. The rider looked at his companion. Something passed between them. "We're border scouts," the first rider said. His voice had changed. The challenge was gone, replaced by something careful and quiet. "We can take you to the border post. There's food and a fire. You can tell us—" "I need to see the king, not a border post. The king. With respect, you can barely stand." "I have the names of every person Lord Theron Blackmoor has killed in the past 10 years. Her voice found something. Not strength exactly, but the memory of strength, the echo of her mother standing in a doorway. 14 villages, over 400 people. I have their names and I have the proof, and I have walked 39 days to bring them here, and I will not give them to a border post. I will give them to the king." The scouts brought her to the border post anyway because she collapsed before they could put her on a horse. She woke on a cot by a fire with a blanket over her and a bowl of broth beside her, and a man sitting across from her with twin short swords on his back and a thin scar across his right eyebrow and the most watchful eyes she had ever seen. "My name is Corwin," he said. "I'm the king's shield. The border scouts sent word. I rode through the night." He leaned forward. "They said you have names." Sable sat up. Every part of her body protested. She ignored it. She looked at Corwin, and she saw in his watchful brown eyes the same thing she had seen in Dagny's. Not pity, but recognition. The recognition of someone who understands what it costs to carry something heavy a long way. "I have 412 names," she said, "and I can recite every one of them. The king is riding from the hold. He'll be here by morning. Can you wait until—" "I've waited 39 days. I can wait one more." She looked at him. "But I'll start now. For you. So someone else knows." She began. "Ashenmere, 63 souls. Elowyn, daughter of Maeve, daughter of Seren, healer, keeper, my mother." Her voice did not break. It was steady and clear, and it filled the small border post like water filling a cup. "Hale, son of Phelan, carpenter, his wife Marin, daughter of Lisbeth. Their sons Fen and Rowan, twins, 7 years old," she continued. Name after name, family connections, occupations, ages. Not a list, but a testimony. Each name spoken with the full weight of a person who had lived and breathed and mattered. Corwin listened. He did not write anything down. He sat very still, and he listened, and his hands rested on his knees, and his face was unreadable except for his eyes, which grew brighter and brighter as the names accumulated, not with tears, but with something harder, a cold, focused fury that had found its target and was taking aim. She recited for 3 hours. Ashenmere, Thornwick, Brackenmoor, Fiddler's Crossing, Mill Hollow, village after village, name after name, the dead-given voice in a border post by a barefoot woman with a healer's hands and a memory that could not be burned. When she finished, the fire had burned low and the candles had guttered and the gray light of dawn was seeping through the shutters. Corwin stood. He walked to the door. He opened it and stood in the cold morning air and breathed, and when he turned back, his jaw was set like iron. "The king needs to hear this," he said. "That's what I've been saying." Calder Greymoor arrived at the border post at mid-morning on the 40th day of Sable's walk. He came with a small escort, 6 riders, traveling fast. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, his boots hitting the ground with the heavy certainty of a man who did not wait for things to be ready before he acted. He was taller than anyone Sable had seen on the road, 6 feet 4 inches of broad-shouldered muscle, dark hair streaked with gray at the temples, gray eyes that swept the border post and found her immediately. He wore dark wool and leather, a charcoal cloak clasped with an iron pin shaped like a mountain. No crown. He came into the post. The room shrank around him, not because he was loud or imposing, but because he was so completely present that the space reorganized itself around his attention. Corwin spoke first. Quietly, economically, the way he did everything. He told the king what Sable had recited through the night. 412 names, 14 villages, a decade of systematic destruction, proof in a leather pouch carried 40 days on foot. Calder looked at Sable. She looked back. She was sitting on the cot with the blanket around her shoulders and the leather pouch in her lap, and her ruined feet bare on the stone floor. And she met the Alpha King's gray eyes with her dark amber-brown ones, and she did not look away. "You walked," he said. "Yes. 40 days, through Blackmoor territory, alone." "Yes." "Barefoot." "I lost my boots in a bog on the 3rd day. I walked the rest without them." He looked at her feet. She watched him look, and she saw what Corwin had seen, what the border scout had seen. The involuntary flinch, the tightening of the jaw. But Calder's reaction went further. Something shifted behind his gray eyes, a deep tectonic movement, the kind of shift that rearranges landscapes. "The names," he said. "All of them." "Please," she began again. "Ashenmere. 63 souls. Elowyn, her mother." She spoke each name the same way she had spoken them to Corwin, with the same clarity, the same weight, the same refusal to let a single one become just a sound. Calder listened standing. He did not sit. He stood with his hands at his sides and his gray eyes fixed on her face, and he listened to every name of every person from every village that Theron Blackmoor had erased. And Sable watched something happen to his face that she would think about for the rest of her life. She watched a king's composure crack. Not dramatically. There was no outburst, no raised voice, no fist against the wall. Just a slow, steady fracturing, like ice breaking up on a river in spring, the pieces shifting and separating to reveal what was underneath. What was underneath was grief, and beneath the grief, resolve. The cold, absolute, immovable resolve of a man who had just been given 412 reasons to go to war. She finished. The room was very quiet. Calder Greymoor, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, walked forward until he was standing directly in front of the cot where she sat. He was so tall that standing while she sat put her face level with his chest. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. And then the Alpha King went to his knees. Not a bow, not a nod of respect. He knelt on the stone floor of a border post in front of a barefoot Omega healer who had walked 40 days through enemy territory to bring him the names of the dead. And he placed his hands on his thighs, and he bowed his head, and he stayed there. The room went silent. Corwin, who had seen his king in battle, and in grief and in rage, had never seen him kneel. The border scouts in the doorway stared. The fire crackled. The morning light came through the shutters and fell on the king's bowed head and on Sable's ruined feet and on the leather pouch in her lap. "Thank you," Calder said. His voice was rough, scraped raw by what he had heard. "For carrying them, for walking, for not stopping." Sable looked at the crown of his head. Dark hair streaked with gray, the hair of a man who had been carrying too much for too long. She understood then that she was not the only one in the room who was tired, that he had been waiting for this. Not for her specifically, but for proof, for evidence, for the thing he needed to act on what he had suspected for years, but could not prove. She had brought it on her bare feet, and he was kneeling because he understood what it had cost. She put her hand on the top of his head, lightly, the way a healer touches a patient, the way her mother had touched her when she was small. "Stand up," she said softly. "There's work to do." He lifted his head. His gray eyes met hers, and something passed between them. Not the bond, not yet, but the precursor to it, the recognition of two people who carry names. He stood. Sable was carried to Greymoor Hold. She did not want to be carried, but her body had finally, completely, irrevocably given out, and the choice was taken from her by the simple fact that her legs would not hold her weight. Calder lifted her onto his horse himself, not a gesture of possession, but of practicality, because she weighed almost nothing, and his horse was the strongest, and the ride was long. She fell asleep against the horse's neck before they cleared the border post. She slept for the entire ride. She did not dream. She woke in a room, a real room, with stone walls and a window and a fire and a bed with actual sheets. The ceiling was gray granite, roughly hewn, and for a disoriented moment she was back in Ashenmere, looking up at the rafters of her mother's cottage, waiting for the smell of yarrow tea and the sound of her mother humming. Then the pain hit, all of it. 40 days of deferred suffering arriving at once, crashing over her in waves, her feet, her legs, her back, her hands, the hunger in her stomach, the rawness in her throat, the bone-deep exhaustion that made even blinking feel like labor. She gasped and gripped the sheets, and the door opened, and a small, compact woman with steel-gray hair and round spectacles and the sharpest black eyes Sable had ever seen walked in, carrying a basin of steaming water. "Don't move," the woman said. Not a request, a medical instruction delivered with the absolute authority of someone who had been giving medical instructions for 3 decades. "My name is Briar. I'm the Hold's healer. I've been treating your feet for 6 hours while you slept. You're going to be in this bed for at least a week, and you're not going to argue about it." "My feet. Your feet are a horror and a miracle, and I have feelings about them that I will not discuss because I am a professional." Briar set the basin down and pulled back the sheet, and Sable saw that her feet were wrapped in clean white bandages, neatly done with the particular precision of someone who took bandaging as seriously as an art form. The broken toes have been set. The infected lacerations have been cleaned and dressed. The callousing is remarkable, and I'm going to study it. You will walk again. It will hurt, but you will walk. Sable lay back against the pillow. The sheets were clean, the fire was warm, the bandages on her feet were tight and careful, and the throbbing beneath them was dulled by whatever Briar had applied. The leather pouch, Sable said. The one I was carrying. Where is it? With the king. He hasn't put it down since you arrived. I believe he's reading it for the 4th time. Briar looked at her over the rim of her spectacles. You carried that across the mountains barefoot? Yes. Good. Now sleep. Sable slept. She slept for 2 days, waking only when Briar fed her, broth first, then bread, then a stew, thick with root vegetables and barley. Briar managed her like a siege campaign, administering food and medicine and rest in calculated waves, rebuilding Sable's body the way a mason rebuilds a wall, 1 stone at a time. On the 3rd day, Sable sat up. On the 4th, she stood. On the 5th, with Briar watching from the doorway, with an expression that suggested she was prepared to tackle Sable back into bed if necessary, Sable walked to the window and looked out. Greymoor Hold spread below her, a vast, dark granite fortress built into the mountainside, its towers and walls looking like they had grown from the rock itself. Below the walls, the moorland stretched in every direction, gray-green and open, crossed by silver streams and dark pine groves. It was beautiful the way mountains are beautiful, not soft, not gentle, but permanent, a landscape that would outlast everything built upon it. Sable! She turned. Calder stood in the doorway. He had not changed much from the border post, same dark wool and leather, same gray eyes, same quiet density of presence. But he was holding a small, leather-bound book that she had not seen before. May I come in? She nodded. He entered and sat in the chair by the fire. He was too large for it. His knees came up too high and his shoulders were wider than the back. But he sat in it anyway, with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that entering a recovering woman's room required making himself as unthreatening as possible. I've read the documents, your mother's records, the village names, the dates, the patterns. He paused. Your mother was remarkable. She was a keeper. It's what we do. You're a keeper, too. I'm the last one. The words hung in the room. The last one. The last woman in a bloodline of women who held names, and the village that had given that bloodline its purpose was Ash. Calder opened the leather-bound book. I keep a ledger, he said. Not of property or profit, of loss. Every person who has died under my protection since I became king at 20. Every name. He turned the pages. They were filled with his handwriting. Careful, angular, the script of a man who wrote names the way some men sharpen swords with discipline and intention. 427 names in 14 years. He looked at her. You carried 412 in 40 days. She stared at the ledger, at his handwriting, at the names. You keep names, she said. It was not a question. I learned from a woman who taught me that forgetting is a political act. If you forget who died, you forget who killed them. And if you forget who killed them, they kill again. Who taught you that? My mother. They looked at each other across the firelit room, and Sable felt something shift in her chest. Not the bond, not yet, but the foundations of it, the deep structural recognition of 2 people built from the same material, 2 people who carried names. He came back every day. Not announced, not scheduled, just present, appearing in her doorway in the late afternoon when the light went gold through the window, sitting in the 2 small chair by the fire, talking. They talked about the names first, then about the villages, then about healing and ruling and the particular weight of being the person everyone looked to and the loneliness of carrying things that no one else could carry. He told her about becoming king at 20, about his father dying in a hunting accident that was probably not an accident, and his mother dying of grief 6 months later, or possibly of poison, and the investigation that led nowhere, and the crown that landed on his head before he had finished mourning. About the first year of his reign, when 3 border lords had challenged his authority and he had ridden out to each one personally, not with an army but with 12 men and a willingness to fight that was so absolute and so visibly genuine that the lords had looked at him and looked at the 12 men, and looked at the boy king, whose gray eyes held no bluff in them, and decided that this was not a battle worth starting. "I was terrified," he said. "Every time, all 3 times. My hands were shaking inside my gauntlets." "But you went." "I went because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't. The difference between courage and cowardice is not whether you're afraid. It's which fear you choose to obey." She thought about the moment she had stepped out of Ashenmere's ashes and turned north, about the terror of starting a walk she might not finish, toward a destination she might never reach, carrying names that might never be heard. She had been afraid of every step. She had taken every step anyway, not because she was brave, but because the alternative, sitting in the ashes and letting the names die with her, was a fear she could not live with. "I know exactly what you mean," she said. He looked at her, and in the gold afternoon light, his gray eyes were warm, and she thought, this is what it feels like to be understood. Not admired, not pitied, not placed on a pedestal for what you survived. Understood, by someone who has done their own version of the same impossible walk. "You have gray in your hair," she said one afternoon. "You're 34. "It started when I was 22, after the border war." "How many names from the border war?" 89. She reached out and touched the gray at his temple. Her healer's hand, the long fingers that had mixed poultices and set bones and dressed wounds and carried a leather pouch across a mountain range. She touched the gray hair the way she would touch an injury, gently, diagnostically, with the careful attention of someone assessing damage. "That's not age," she said. "That's weight." "Yes." "You're carrying too much." "Yes." "Let me help." He went very still. His gray eyes searched her face. "You just walked 40 days barefoot through enemy territory. You nearly died. You're in a bed with bandaged feet, and you're offering to help me." "I'm a healer. It's what I do." Something cracked in his face. The same fracturing she had seen at the border post, ice on a river, the composure breaking up to show what was underneath. But this time what was underneath was not grief. It was something warmer, something that had been waiting a long time to be seen. He placed his hand on the bed beside hers. Not touching. Close. An offer. She closed the distance. Her fingers found his. Rough, calloused, the hands of a man who trained with swords and wrote names in ledgers and had knelt on a stone floor for a barefoot woman he had never met. Her fingers laced through his and held on. His wolf recognized hers. She felt it, a deep, resonant hum that started in her chest and radiated outward, a frequency she had never felt before, but knew immediately. The way you know your own name, the way you know your mother's voice in a crowd. His wolf and her wolf meeting through the skin of their hands, saying to each other, "There you are, I've been looking." They sat in the golden afternoon light with their fingers interlaced, and neither of them spoke because the wolves were speaking for them and the language they used had no need for words. Briar let Sable walk unassisted after 10 days. The walking was slow and painful, and nothing like the walking she had done on the road. This was careful, measured, rehabilitative, a healer relearning her own body. But she walked. Briar watched from her workroom with an expression that was equal parts professional satisfaction and barely suppressed fury at the man who had made the walking necessary. Sable asked to work in the healing rooms. Briar considered this for exactly 3 seconds before handing her a mortar and pestle and a pile of dried yarrow. "Show me your grind," she said. Sable ground the yarrow the way her mother had taught her, fine and even, the pestle rotating in her palm, the herb releasing its sharp, clean scent into the air. Briar watched, adjusted her spectacles, said nothing, handed her more yarrow. Within a week, Sable was working beside Briar as though she had always been there. Their styles were different. Briar was precise and economical, every movement calibrated. Sable was intuitive, following the feel of things, her hands knowing what to do before her mind caught up. But the differences complemented each other, the way different instruments complement each other in a piece of music, each filling the spaces the other left. Briar taught her Greymoor remedies she had never learned in Ashenmere, mountain herb combinations, pine resin poultices, the particular properties of the mineral-rich spring water that flowed from the granite. Sable taught Briar the marsh healing she had grown up with, watermint infusions, peat compresses, the way certain mosses could stop bleeding faster than any bandage. "Your mother taught you well, you," Briar said one afternoon, watching Sable suture a cut on a stable hand's arm with stitches so small and even they looked like embroidery. "She taught me everything." "Not everything. She didn't teach you to stop walking when your feet were bleeding." "No, she taught me that too. She just also taught me when not to listen." Briar made a sound that might have been a laugh. "I'm going to like you," she said. It was the highest compliment she had ever paid anyone in Corwin's memory. The word came back from the eastern border on a cold morning 3 weeks after Sable's arrival. Theron Blackmoor had learned that a survivor of Ashenmere had reached Greymoor. He had learned about the documents, and he was marching, not with an army, not with subtlety, but with a column of soldiers and a retinue of legal advisors carrying treaties and territorial claims, demanding the return of what he called stolen property. The property he was referring to was the leather pouch, and by extension, the woman who had carried it. Calder received the news in the Great Hall. Sable was there. She had been sitting with Briar, reviewing herb inventories, and she watched his gray eyes go flat and cold when Corwin delivered the message. The warmth left his face. What remained was granite. "How many soldiers?" 300, Corwin said, "and a dozen advisors. He's framing it as a legal dispute, not an invasion. He wants the documents returned and the refugee remanded to Blackmoor custody for questioning." "Questioning?" Calder said the word the way you say the name of something rotten. Sable stood. The hall turned to her. "He'll argue the documents are falsified, that my mother fabricated the evidence, that I'm unreliable, a traumatized Omega, displaced, confused. He'll say the villages were abandoned, not burned, that the people left voluntarily. He'll have documents of his own, forged or coerced, showing land transfers and voluntary relocations. He's had a decade to build his story." Calder looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because my mother tracked him for years. She knew his methods. He doesn't just destroy, he rewrites. He burns the truth and builds a lie on top of the ashes, and he's been doing it so long that the lie has foundations." "Then how do we prove the truth?" Sable looked at him steadily. "You can burn a document. You can forge a treaty. You can bribe a witness and demolish a village and scatter the survivors." She placed her hand flat on the table. "You cannot burn a keeper's memory. I have 412 names, and I can tell you every one of them with their family connections, their ages, their villages, and the dates those villages were destroyed. That is not a document he can challenge. That is a living record carried in a mind that does not forget. And if he stands in this hall and calls those villages abandoned, I will name every person who lived in them, and the dead will answer him." The great hall was very quiet. Calder looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Corwin. Then he looked back at Sable. And slowly, deliberately, the Alpha King of Greymoor smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had just realized that the woman standing in front of him was the most dangerous weapon in the room, and she carried no blade at all. "Let him come," Calder said. Theron Blackmoor arrived at Greymoor Hold on a grey morning, his column stretching back along the moor road, his banners snapping in the wind. He rode at the front on a black horse, dressed in furs and silk, his thin blonde hair combed carefully over his scalp, his cold green eyes sweeping the Hold's walls with the calculating assessment of a man pricing real estate. He was received in the great hall. Calder sat at the head of the long table, Corwin at his right. Sable sat at the table's far end, the leather pouch in front of her, her bandaged feet hidden beneath her chair. She wore a dark green dress that Briar had found for her, and her thick twists were pulled back from her face, and her dark eyes were steady. Theron's legal advisors laid out their case with the smooth efficiency of men paid very well to make lies sound like procedure. Treaties, land transfer records, documents showing voluntary relocations, signed with marks that could have been anyone's. A narrative of orderly expansion, legal acquisition, peaceful resettlement. Theron sat back and let them work. He did not look at Sable. He did not acknowledge her existence. She was, in his calculation, a displaced Omega, a nobody, a survivor of a village that no longer existed, and therefore, in his logic, had never existed at all. When the advisors finished, Calder turned to Sable. "The floor is yours." She stood. The great hall was full. Calder's advisors, Theron's retinue, Greymoor's household, Corwin and Briar, and the border scouts who had found her on the moor. Every eye turned to her. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The hall's acoustics carried her words the way stone carries vibration, faithfully without distortion. Lord Blackmoor's records show that the village of Thornwick was voluntarily relocated 8 years ago. She looked at Theron. He was looking at her now. His green eyes were flat and calculating. Thornwick had 41 residents. Let me tell you who they were. She named them. All 41, names, ages, family connections. She described the village, its layout, its well, the bridge over the creek that Aldrich the stonemason had built with his own hands. She described it with the perfect fidelity of a memory that did not blur or dim or conveniently rearrange itself. Thornwick did not relocate, she said. It was burned on the night of the autumn equinox 8 years ago. Aldrich the stonemason was killed defending the bridge he built. His wife Constance and their children Pella and Marsh were never seen again. They did not sign a relocation document. They are dead. Theron's advisors shifted in their seats. Theron's jaw tightened. Sable continued. Brackenmoor, 28 names. Fiddler's Crossing, 35 names. Village after village, name after name, each one delivered with the calm, clinical precision of a healer reading a diagnosis. She did not dramatize. She did not weep. She spoke the names the way her mother had taught her. As fact, as record, as truth too specific to be fabricated and too complete to be dismissed. When she reached Ashenmere, her voice did not waver. 63 residents. My mother Elowyn, daughter of Maeve, healer and keeper, was killed in the doorway of our cottage by a soldier under Lord Blackmoor's command. I heard his soldiers laughing about it around a campfire on my 5th night walking through his territory. They described her death as easy. They called the clearance of Ashenmere efficient. The hall was silent, the kind of silence that has weight. Theron stood. His face was flushed. His small hands were clenched at his sides. This is the testimony of a single displaced Omega. She has no corroborating witnesses. Her mother's documents could have been 412 names, Sable said, spoken from memory, with ages, families, villages, and dates. Your documents say these people were relocated. I am asking you, Lord Blackmoor, where are they? If they were relocated, where did they go? Name one. Name one person from any of these villages who is alive and relocated and can confirm your records. Theron opened his mouth, closed it. You can't, Sable said, because they're dead, and you killed them, and you thought no one was keeping count. She sat down. Calder stood. He was very tall and very quiet, and his gray eyes were the color of the stone walls around them, hard and ancient and absolutely unmoved. Lord Blackmoor, I am placing you under arrest for the destruction of 14 villages and the deaths of their inhabitants. Your territorial claims are revoked. Your legal advisors may leave peacefully or they may join you. I am indifferent to their choice. Theron lunged, not at Calder but at the table, at the leather pouch, his small, clever hands reaching for the documents that condemned him. Corwin moved like water. Twin short swords cleared their sheaths in the time it took Theron to cross 3 feet of floor, and the tip of one blade rested against Theron's throat before his fingers reached the leather. Don't, Corwin said. One word, sufficient. Theron's soldiers moved. Greymoor's guard answered. But it was not the guards who stopped the confrontation. It was the wolf. Calder's shift was not a spectacle. It was an event, sudden, vast, the displacement of air and light as a man became something older and larger and infinitely more dangerous. The wolf that stood in the great hall was enormous, dark gray and pale-eyed, its shoulders level with the table, its teeth bared in a snarl that vibrated through the stone floor. It did not advance on Theron's soldiers. It simply stood there, between Sable and every threat in the room, and its pale gray eyes moved from face to face with the patient assessment of a predator that was choosing not to kill but wanted everyone to know it was choosing. Theron's soldiers put down their weapons. Every one of them. The sound of iron hitting stone was the sound of a man's decade of careful destruction coming undone in a single room. Theron was taken to the cells. His advisors were given horses and sent south with a message for the border lords. The Alpha King was coming, and he was bringing names. But before Theron was led away, he turned in Corwin's grip and looked at Sable. His cold green eyes found hers across the great hall, and for the first time his composure cracked. Not into fear, not into rage, but into something worse. Bewilderment. The genuine, uncomprehending bewilderment of a man who had spent a decade building a machine of erasure and had just watched it dismantled by a woman he had not bothered to kill. You were nothing, he said. Not a taunt, a statement of fact as he understood it. You were a healer's daughter in a village of 63 people. You were no one. Sable looked at him. She thought about the soldier kicking in her mother's door, about the soldiers laughing around a campfire, about the ledgers of voluntary relocation and the forged land transfers, and the careful, methodical, bureaucratic annihilation of people who had done nothing wrong except exist in a place a powerful man wanted to own. I was someone who remembered, she said, and you were someone who forgot that we would. Corwin took him away. The great hall emptied slowly, the way water drains from a vessel, not all at once, but in a gradual lowering of tension, people moving toward doorways and corridors, the sound of armor and boot steps echoing off the stone, the torches guttered, the fire in the great hearth settled into its coals. Sable stood at the table for a long time after everyone had gone. Her hand rested on the leather pouch, the pages inside it, her mother's handwriting, the names that had walked with her across 40 days of ground. She had carried them here. She had spoken them aloud. They had been heard. She pressed her palm flat against the leather and whispered, "I did it, Mama." They heard the names. That evening, Sable sat in the healing room and ground yarrow. The repetitive motion calmed her. Push, rotate, grind, the herb releasing its sharp, clean scent, her hands doing what they knew how to do. Briar sat across from her, sorting dried lavender, saying nothing, providing the particular comfort of a person who understands that sometimes the best thing you can give someone is quiet company and purposeful work. Calder appeared in the doorway. Human again, his gray eyes tired, his dark hair mussed, the iron mountain pin askew on his cloak. He looked at Sable grinding yarrow, and something in his face softened, the granite easing into something warmer, the way a mountain looks different when the sun hits it just right. "You were extraordinary today," he said. "I was accurate." "There's a difference." "There's really not." Briar stood, adjusted her spectacles, and walked out of the room with the purposeful stride of a woman who was very pointedly not witnessing a private moment. Calder sat in the chair Briar had vacated. The healing room smelled like yarrow and lavender and the clean mineral scent of the spring water. Sable's hands kept moving, push, rotate, grind. "My wolf knew," he said quietly. "At the border post. When you started saying the names, my wolf knew before I did." "Knew what?" "That you were carrying something that belonged to both of us. That the names you held and the names I held were pieces of the same work. That we were." He stopped, searched for the word. "Matched." She set down the mortar. She looked at him. The firelight caught the gray at his temples and the scar on his forearm and the tiredness in his eyes, and the warmth beneath the tiredness. "I walked 40 days to bring those names to someone who would do something about them," she said. "I didn't know it would be you. I didn't know you kept names too. I didn't know any of it. I just walked. And I knelt. Yes. I'd do it again. Every day. For the rest of my life." She reached across the table. Her healer's hand found his. Rough, calloused, the hand that had written 427 names in a leather-bound book because he believed that remembering was a form of ruling and forgetting was a form of violence. Her fingers interlaced with his. She felt the hum again. Wolf to wolf, frequency to frequency, two animals recognizing their own kind. "I'm not going to kneel for you," she said. "I've done enough kneeling. And enough walking. I don't want you to kneel. I want you to stay. Here. In the healing rooms, in the hold, wherever you want to be. Not because I claimed you, because you chose it. And if I choose to keep walking, if there are more names out there, more villages, more people who need a healer, then I'll walk with you. And I'll carry the names you're too tired to carry. And when your feet hurt, I'll be the ground beneath them." She laughed. It was small and rough and surprised out of her, the first laugh in 47 days, and it felt like setting a bone, painful and correct. "That," she said, "is the worst metaphor I've ever heard. I'm a king, not a poet." "Clearly." They sat in the healing room with their hands interlaced and the yarrow scent in the air and the fire crackling, and neither of them moved, and neither of them needed to. The memorial was Sable's idea. She drew it herself, a long, curved wall of dark granite, set into the hillside below the hold where the morning light hit first. Into the stone, a mason carved names, all of them, 412, organized by village, each one cut deep enough to last centuries. Ashenmere at the center, because that was where the keeper had lived, and that was where the keeping had begun. Elowyn's name was carved largest, not because she was more important than anyone else, but because she was the one who had written it all down, who had tracked the destruction, who had handed her daughter the proof and the names and told her to run, the one who had stood in a doorway and not moved. Sable stood at the wall on the day it was finished, her hand resting on her mother's carved name, and she felt something release inside her. Not the grief would never fully leave, but the pressure of carrying it alone. The names were in the stone now. They were held by something harder and more permanent than memory. They would be here after Sable was gone, after Calder was gone, after the hold itself crumbled. The names would remain. Calder stood beside her, not touching, close. "I choose this," she said. "The wall? All of it. The wall, the hold, the healing rooms, you." She looked at him. "Not because you knelt, not because you gave me shelter or safety or a place to work. Because you keep names, because you understand why it matters. Because when I said 412 names in a border post, you didn't ask for proof. You listened." He took her hand. Their fingers laced together the way they always did, her healer's hand in his king's hand. Two people who carried the weight of names, finding that the weight was lighter when shared. The binding was held at the memorial wall at dawn. Sable stood with her bare feet on the grass, healed now, scarred and calloused and strong, the feet of a woman who had walked 40 days through enemy territory and would walk wherever she chose for the rest of her life. Calder stood facing her, his gray eyes bright in the early light, his iron mountain pin at his throat. There were no traditional words. There was no claiming. There was only this. Sable spoke first. "My name is Sable. I am the last keeper of Ashenmere. I carry 412 names in my memory, and I will carry them until I die. And I will teach my daughter to carry them after me. I choose you, Calder Greymoor. Not as a mate claims a mate, as a keeper chooses a keeper, because the names need both of us." Calder spoke. "My name is Calder. I am the Alpha King of Greymoor, and I have 427 names in a ledger, and I will carry them until I die, and I will teach our children to carry them after me. I choose you, Sable. Not as a king claims a queen, as a man kneels to a woman who walked further than he has ever walked, on feet that bled for every step to bring him the truth. I will spend my life earning the ground you crossed." He did not kneel this time. She did not want him to. They stood eye to eye, hand in hand, equals before the wall of names that held them both accountable. She kissed him. On the grass, at the memorial wall, with 412 names carved in stone behind them, and the sun coming up over the moor, and her scarred bare feet on the ground that was now hers. She kissed him, and his arms came around her, and their wolves met inside them, the massive gray and the small dark brown, the siege engine and the distance runner. And the sound they made together was not a howl. It was a hum, low and deep and resonant, the frequency of two creatures that had been looking for each other across a landscape of loss and had finally, at the border of everything, found each other. Briar wept, briefly and furiously, and then blew her nose and returned to the healing rooms because there were patients waiting, and sentiment, in her professional opinion, was no excuse for a late poultice. Corwin stood at the edge of the gathering, his twin blades on his back, his watchful eyes bright. He had been the first to hear the names. He would remember that for the rest of his life. That afternoon, Sable went to the healing rooms. She hung her cloak by the door. She rolled up her sleeves. She picked up the mortar and pestle and began to grind yarrow, the sharp, clean scent filling the room, her healer's hands doing what they had always done. The work of mending, the work of keeping, the quiet daily labor of a woman who had walked 40 days barefoot through enemy territory and now stood in her own healing room, in her own hold, grinding herbs for people who were hers to care for. She said the names while she worked. Not all 412, just a few. Her mother's, Hale the carpenter's, little Pim's, who had loved having his tongue checked. She said them the way she always would, the way her mother had taught her. Not as grief, not as a list, as a record, as a keeping, as the quiet, unbreakable act of a woman who remembered everything and chose to carry it forward, one step at a time, on feet that had learned what the ground was made of and had decided to match it. Outside the window, the moor stretched to the mountains. The memorial wall stood in the morning light. The names carved in the stone would be there tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. And somewhere on the road between Ashenmere and Greymoor, a single boot sat on a stone, marking the place where a woman had decided to walk the rest of the way on her own 2 feet. She had walked. She had arrived. She had been met on her knees by a king who understood what she carried. And now she was home.